Hey BookTube, I'm doing the Sunday read-along of the Four Gospels, led by, as created by Steve Donoghue. This is reading them as literature. No need to be religious here, and indeed I'm not a religious person, I'm an atheist. And so yes, we've gotten through Matthew and Mark, and this week it is Luke that we are reading. Luke, who, after I guess the very more kind of rough-hewn Mark, who seemed kind of this more kind of primitive writer, we get this week it's very much more a smooth, urbane fellow who seems to be doing the writing. And indeed, it's somebody who starts off talking about referring to himself as like me. In the text, I'm using the King James text, so at least that's where it is there. And he's addressing a particular reader, Theophilus, which it may be a name, may also just be a kind of a lover of God. But there's sort of like it seems like, oh, here's an audience, and this is it's going to be addressed to another believer, and setting down the events yet again, of Jesus's birth, life and death, and his teachings along the way and stuff like that, but ordered in what he thinks is like a really great way, which I guess it must have been because it became canonical. And it's interesting. This is one of these things of we're getting yet another retelling of Jesus's life, and using all these events and ordering them slightly, kind of slightly changing stuff. I mean, this one has got kind of a prequel where you've got the birth of John the Baptist, and you've got the birth of Jesus, and you have sort of some of his childhood, and there's all these like different variations from the first two texts. To give you just that kind of just those different shadings of stuff. This is a less angry Jesus. Again, this in some ways seems to be much more of a smoother, more palatable Jesus in a way. You can tell that this is like maybe becoming a little less kind of scrappy religion, and seems a little bit more established. At least that's how I feel about it. Or maybe this is just Luke is a very dominant use of that kind of Luke in particular maybe is used by a particular strain of Christianity, which seems to be a little bit more like settled with itself and a little less anxious and stuff like that. That's just the feeling I get from the text, my very ignorant feeling. This is for me. It's funny, they talk about rereads, and I haven't reread the Bible. This is probably my first kind of a concerted thing at the Bible. I mean, there's all the Bible you absorb during your life, but having going through each one of these books, I feel like I'm rereading. We're each time we're just revisiting the same events again, and you're like, oh, and you start thinking about things deeper, and it's got that going for it. It's interesting that, you have the prequel being different. There's this whole, we got to have the lineage trace. And this time, instead of just going back to David, it goes back to Adam, which seems to be that we're shifting from converting or talking to a kind of a Jewish Christian audience to a more of a Gentile audience in general who are Christians. And I guess, again, as Steve pointed out, well, Jesus wasn't actually related to Joseph, but we're using Joseph as the legal patriarchal line back, because this is a male dominated society, so we wouldn't want to use Mary, even though that she actually does have some contribution to Jesus's DNA. So that's one of those interesting cultural things that I think is, you have to kind of tip it down to that, like, oh, we're not going to consider the mother. This is important legal stuff. It's got to be the father that we're going to have to go with, even if it isn't. Even what the guy, this is just the guy who's not even the father. He's just, I don't know. So yes, there's that, and there's the last words. Yeah, the last words in this are definitely a lot different. In Matthew and Mark, it is, oh my God, why have you forsaken me? Well, in Luke, there's a lot more. He's a lot more talkative. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. And then he gave up the ghost. So, which is a lot more. I commend my spirit. Like I submit to you, my, my God. Versus, why have you forsaken me? And then dying. And Yeah, I find that's much more kind of like that's kind of the supernatural Jesus versus the kind of the man who I see of my God, why have you forsaken me at the end. So, but I can see why theologically that would be pretty important to a pretty important shift of going from like this is a supernatural creature who has come down and this is what he was always meant to do. So why would he have this moment of doubt on the cross at the very end where he doesn't even seem to have like he has to get resurrected before all the other stuff happens. I can see why that's there. I'm rambling. I'm not going to go too much, I guess, into the book. Um, Again, I find this as a process of just kind of rehashing the same events over and over again. Actually, is rewarding in some ways. Stuff like illness is a metaphor in the story of Jesus in general throughout these three books that we've gone through so far. Just the idea of Jesus, healing the sick and the infirm, and also obviously some people here who've got like a mental illness or who've got epilepsy, and being referred to as them being possessed by demons, and Jesus is exorcising the demons from them, and it's like that. You can see that kind of echoing now, even now, where everything it's all mental illness, and there's other illnesses which are stigmatized, aha, stigmata, where it's seen as the evil. And as human beings, I don't know if that's an animal thing of like, you see somebody else, a creature who is ill, you have a tendency to shy away, which has got maybe some kind of weird evolutionary thing to it, or like, oh, that person's different, or I don't understand why they're acting the way they are. Maybe they're unpredictable. Oh, am I in danger? That kind of instinctive fear out of ignorance, which it's carried in this book, and you have this supernatural figure who is healing them and is casting out demons, and that's one of these stories that we tell ourselves is obviously it's been a very damaging one. I know that for a lot of people with like a mental illness, the mental illness is one problem, but the compounding problems on top of all of that are how friends, family, people who you might employers and stuff like that treat you. Like, if it was a much less, this isn't the evil thing that we must cast you out, we must push you away. If it was a much more accepting and understanding thing, there'd be a lot of mitigation of the harm. And so it's interesting that this is one of these old stories that we tell ourselves, and that's definitely an example of a damaging one. And I'm not blaming particularly, Christianity for that. I'm just saying Christianity as one of the bearers of our stories. It's an example of that. And it's a very, it's one of the ones I think that we wrestle with nowadays and are trying to tell ourselves stories in a different way from that. There's also other stuff like, poor Judas in this book. He, as in all the books, he always gets introduced as Judas, Iscariot, the traitor. Like, at the very beginning, like there's never any question. He's predestined to be this. It's interesting in Luke here. He's like Judas, yep, introduced as a traitor, and we get up to the betrayal part, and it's like, yep, Satan entered him, and it's like, well, what does that mean? Did like a supernatural demon come into him and possess him and then get him to do that? Because I guess that's as close as we get to character motivation. These aren't stories that were like lots of psychology in them, but it's interesting that in this one, it's like Satan entered him. We're trying to explain it in a way, or, so yeah, I thought that was an interesting development of some writers tweaking stuff or trying to trying to solutions to like, well, why did Judas do this? It's like, well, Satan entered him. That's why Judas did that. And yeah, it's not satisfying. I've always heard the kind of the theory of like, oh well, Judas was actually he was probably the best of the disciples because he accepted this key role, but of course he also gets completely damned for it and is going to hell. And so in some ways that contradicts that kind of interpretation of it. But yeah, So that I thought that was interesting. I have to say though, in the repetitions of like, going through and getting to get deeper in and reading the stuff over and over again, which I think is a useful thing of as the Gospels as a collected work is it gets you to kind of keep on going through this story again and again and try and think about it. I can see this will probably reward rereading later on in my life. Again, even if it's not something I believe in, it's something that it's you can wrestle with, and you can see new things. I mean, this is definitely one of these texts. If you can read whatever, you can read so much into this, and hopefully keep yourself anchored, but hopefully get a reward from that. But God, I'm so tired of Jesus wrangling with the Pharisees, and just all this. It's. I mean, I guess it comes down to the spirit of the law versus the letter of the law, and it's there's a lot of letter of the law. There's a lot of hypocrisy. A part of it, I think, in this one is Jesus such a smooth guy here that of course. Anybody who's up against him, they always fail. It's like the worst kind of religious, there's been a bunch of like kind of movies of, kind of arguing against atheism and stuff like that. And they always portray their opponents as straw men and as, they're angry or they're heartless or they're always tearing them down and presenting the worst, most ridiculous example. And I mean, both sides are guilty of that, but I find that in the Bible as well, that Jesus does so well against the Pharisees. I start saying like, well, maybe the Pharisees have a point. This guy is really disruptive. This guy, there's a reason we have rules and that's all right for Jesus to come in and say all these things. But, I don't know. So, I think this has been a very rambly video. I'm probably gonna, I'm just gonna cut it short here, and we'll go for that. This is my entry in the 4 Gospels. We got one more to go, the Gospel according to John, and then I'll have made it through this read-a-thon. This read along, where I have to say, boy, Steve did. I can't imagine. I struggled to keep up even with this extremely light load. That's a combination of work and of I think having to go through this semi slowly. It's not like super easy fast read. This isn't. Steve said, I think he's talking about, it's like 20 minutes per gospel, and it's like no, Steve, not for us mere mortals. But enough complaining. I'll now I get to go and watch his video and see what he said and find out all the stuff I missed and get to watch everybody else's videos on this, which I enjoy and then feel very inadequate about, but I'm sure as we all do. So see you next Sunday, probably next Sunday. Yeah, bye for now.